established in 1899 by the government-chartered Bureau of American Ethnology. In that year, with the assistance of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it produced 67 maps that plotted every cession since the founding of the nation. In truth, cession boundaries were neither well-defined nor contiguous. On paper, they traced watersheds that no 19th century surveyor could determine with any precision. They extended to foothills. Exactly where they were located was anyone's guess. And they took direct paths to mountaintops that could not be accurately identified. Sometimes it was easier for federal officials to describe not the cession itself, but the reduced tract reserve for the indigenous nation. In 1823, for example, the Seminoles relinquished all claim or title which they may have to the whole territory of Florida in exchange for a much smaller, clearly delineated area that they were to be concentrated and confined. It is appealing to imagine, as the Bureau of American Ethnology did, that the entire country came into the possession of the United States through consistent and well-defined legal mechanisms. But in fact, sometimes it was not clear even to the federal government by what right it owned the land. In 1851, for example, 3 federal commissioners headed off to California, acquired from Mexico only 3 years earlier, with vague instructions to conciliate the good feelings of the Indians and to get them to ratify those feelings by entering into written treaties binding on them towards the government and each other. Congress remained uncertain whether native Californians constituted a formidable opposition of 300,000, as some said, or a pitiful remnant of 40,000, as others asserted. Nor could it decide whether the United States came into full possession of the land by the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed with Mexico, or whether indigenous peoples still had title. The commissioners entered into a series of treaties with small groups and even single families, satisfying neither the advocates of California natives nor the speculators who desired their land. Congress refused to ratify the agreements and instead simply concluded that title no longer rested with native peoples. Elsewhere, the United States employed 3 legal instruments to dispossess residents. Treaties predominated until 1871, when Congress voted to end the practice. Negotiated under duress or facilitated with bribes, they were often violated soon after ratification, despite the language of perpetuity. Nonetheless, they presume a nation-to-nation relationship which still informs U.S. Indian policy today. Less well known are the 2 other tools of dispossession: federal legislation and executive order. Both Congress and the President can create reservations and take them away, and the President used this power extensively in the 19th century. In July 1864, for example, President Abraham Lincoln created a reservation within present-day Washington state for the Chehalis people, reducing their once extensive homeland of 5 million acres by the measure of the Bureau of American Ethnology to about 6 sections, with which they were satisfied. According to a letter from the Office of Indian Affairs, the measure of satisfaction must be judged by the alternative, which was removal and joint occupation of another reservation. As a section is 640 acres, about 6 would have come to about 4,000 acres. 22 years later, President Grover Cleveland, with the stroke of a pen, further reduced the reservation to 3 fractional sections, a piddling 471 acres. There was some irony to this land seizure. When the federal government created the Sahalis Reservation in 1864, it paid a squatter named D. Mounts $3,500, a sum which he considered not unreasonable, for title to his overlapping land claim, though of course the true owners were the Sahalis themselves. When President Cleveland further reduced the reservation in 1886, the Sahalis received nothing. Since the 1990s, the Sahalis have been buying up adjacent land, and in 2010, the reservation was 4,215 acres, according to the SahalisTribe.org website. It is high time for non-Native Americans to come to terms with the fact that the United States is built on someone else's land. Their 19th century counterparts wrestled more deeply with the dispossession that underlay the nation than most people do today. Native peoples were benighted and in a degraded state, wrote one Kentucky resident to the editor of the Western Recorder in 1825, expressing the widespread condescension that whites felt towards Native peoples at the time. But, he continued, this continent is their home. It is the land of their fathers. We are foreign intruders. The writer, informed by Christian universalism, was no modern-day multiculturalist. Nonetheless, the presence of Native peoples in Kentucky forced him to reconcile their dominion over the land, from time immemorial, as colonists often said, with the imperious claims of the United States. 5 years later, in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law an act to provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi. Popularly known as Indian removal, the act authorized the federal government to deport 100,000 men, women, and children from their homelands, an operation that took most of the decade and cost the lives of thousands of Native people. This massive state-sponsored forced migration, which passed by a mere 5 out of 199 votes in the House of Representatives, marked a turning point when white Americans abdicated their moral responsibility towards the continent's indigenous peoples. The deportation, according to many whites and even some Native activists, was in the best interest of those who were rounded up and driven out. If that was the case, it was because white Americans made it so by defrauding or killing those who wanted to stay. After removal, most indigenous Americans were situated 1,000 miles distant from the center of U.S. population and power on the Atlantic coast. Out of sight and out of mind, Native Americans became relics of the past for most whites. There are many reasons to favor a more inclusive history of the United States that places the dispossession of Native peoples at its center. Such a history erases the artificial distinctions that earlier generations drew to discount the presence of Native peoples, does not privilege the rise of the nation-state, and better reflects the makeup of today's U.S. population, which will soon be majority non-white. Its themes also resonate with 21st century concerns, including state-sponsored social engineering, large-scale population displacement, environmental degradation, and global capitalism. But perhaps the best reason is that it is more faithful to the past. The author teaches in the state of Georgia, where the legislature mandates that graduates of its public universities fulfill a U.S. history requirement, a law born of the belief that an informed populace is essential to democracy. Good history makes for good citizens. A history that glosses over the conquest of the continent is partial in both senses of the word. It misleads people about the past and misinforms their debates about the present. In charting a course for the future, Americans would do well to put the dispossession of Native peoples back on the map.
Gotta take it to